A tough-as-nails judge, known for never letting his emotions show, is left speechless when two black twins stand in his courtroom with a desperate plea.
"Please adopt us, sir."
They cry, their voices trembling with raw emotion. This simple request cracks his steely exterior wide open, revealing a hidden pain that has haunted him for years.
"Why would you ask me to adopt you?"
"Because you're the only one who seems to care. We won't cause any trouble. We promise."
I don't know if I can be what you need."
What secret from the judge's past makes this moment so unbearable? And will these children finally find the home they've always dreamed of? Or will the system fail them again? This is a story of love, redemption, and the extraordinary bond that changes their lives forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across Judge Sam Whitaker's cluttered desk. He wrapped his weathered hands around a steaming cup of coffee, letting its warmth seep into his fingers. The aroma helped clear his mind as he thumbed through the stack of case files before him. Whitaker glanced at the old clock on the wall, 8 a.m. Court would begin in an hour. He adjusted his reading glasses and settled into his familiar routine of reviewing the day's cases. Most were standard foster placement updates, the kind he'd handled countless times over his decades on the bench. Should be straightforward enough, he muttered to himself, reaching for the first file. The name Matthews caught his eye. Brock and James, 9-year-old twins. Their current foster placement with the Smiths was up for renewal. Whitaker scanned the paperwork, noting nothing out of the ordinary. School records, behavior reports, all seemingly in order. He set the file aside with practiced detachment, moving on to the next case. By 9 a.m., the courtroom had filled with its usual Monday morning crowd. Attorneys in pressed suits huddled with their clients, whispering last-minute advice. Social workers clutched thick folders, their faces showing the strain of overwhelming caseloads. The familiar sounds of shuffling papers and quiet conversations created a low hum throughout the room. In the back row, almost hidden from view, sat Brock and James Matthews. The twins' small hands were intertwined, their matching brown eyes wide with apprehension. Their foster mother, Mrs. Smith, sat several rows ahead, her attention focused on her phone. "In the matter of Brock and James Matthews," Whitaker announced, his voice carrying across the courtroom with practiced authority. "Counsel for the foster parents may proceed." The Smiths' attorney, a young woman in a navy suit, rose and began her presentation. "Your Honor, we're seeking a routine renewal of the current placement. The Smiths have provided a stable environment for the past 6 months and—" "Excuse me, Your Honor." The small voice cut through the formal proceedings like a thunderclap. Brock Matthews had risen to his feet, his hand still gripping his brother's. His voice trembled but carried determination. "Please adopt us, sir. We've been in 4 homes. We just want one." The courtroom fell silent. Whitaker felt the weight of every eye in the room turned toward the twins. His carefully maintained professional distance cracked as he looked at the 2 boys. James, still seated, leaned forward slightly. "We won't cause trouble. We promise," he whispered, his voice barely carrying across the hushed room. The words hung in the air, heavy with desperation and hope. Whitaker sat frozen behind his bench, his usual composure shattered. In all his years on the bench, nothing had prepared him for this moment. His throat tightened as he looked at the twins' earnest faces. The legal documents before him suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the raw honesty of their plea. With hands that weren't quite steady, Whitaker reached for his gavel. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. He rose quickly and retreated to his chambers, leaving the stunned courtroom behind. Judge Whitaker's footsteps echoed through the private corridor as he hurried to his chambers, his heart pounding against his chest. Once inside, he closed the heavy wooden door with trembling hands and leaned heavily against his desk. The polished surface felt cool beneath his palms as he hung his head, trying to steady his breathing. The familiar scent of leather-bound law books and aged wood did nothing to calm his racing thoughts. The twins' faces wouldn't leave his mind, their hopeful eyes, their clasped hands, their brave voices in that intimidating courtroom. The way the older one had protectively wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders haunted him. He pressed his fingers against his temples, fighting the wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm his usual judicial composure. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Emily Carter, his clerk, peeked in through the door. Her concerned expression told him she'd witnessed his hasty retreat from the courtroom. The stack of files she clutched to her chest suggested she'd been in the middle of something important, but had followed him anyway. "You okay, Judge?" she asked quietly, her voice gentle with understanding. Whitaker lifted a hand, waving her away. "I'm fine," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "It's the twins. Their words." He swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. "It hit me harder than I expected." Emily stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "I can pull their complete case history if you'd like," she offered, already reaching for her tablet. "There might be something we missed in the preliminary review." Whitaker shook his head, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of his black robes. "No, it's not that." He fell silent, running a hand over his face. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There was this case years ago." He turned to face the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. The morning light cast deep shadows across his troubled features. "A custody battle. The mother. She wasn't perfect, but she loved her kids. I followed the letter of the law, separated them." His voice cracked. 6 months later, one of the children died in foster care. Neglect. Emily stood silent, watching as her normally composed mentor struggled with the weight of his confession. Her fingers tightened around her tablet, knuckles turning white. "The system failed them," Whitaker continued, his voice rough with emotion. "And I was part of that failure. I swore I wouldn't let something like that happen again." He pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose, fighting back tears that threatened to fall. But here we are with 2 more children caught in the same broken system. The silence in the chamber felt heavy, broken only by the distant ticking of the wall clock and the muffled sounds of footsteps in the corridor outside. Finally, Whitaker straightened his shoulders, adjusting his tie with hands that still trembled slightly. The mask of judicial authority slipped back into place, though his eyes remained troubled. "I need a moment to think," he told Emily, his voice steadier now. "Please inform the court we'll reconvene shortly." After Emily left, Whitaker stood alone at his window, gazing out at the courthouse grounds below. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and he found himself lost in thought, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak trees outside, their dancing shadows a reminder of how quickly life could change with a single decision. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Whitaker's desk as he spread out the twins' case files. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten, as he immersed himself in the details he'd previously skimmed. Something about the Smiths' foster care history made his stomach churn. He pulled out their records. 8 years of fostering, 27 children through their home. The numbers seemed excessive. While there were no formal complaints, the pattern troubled him. Flipping through caseworker notes, he found carefully worded concerns. Children appear withdrawn. Limited interaction observed between foster parents and children. Basic needs met, but emotional engagement minimal. Whitaker rubbed his tired eyes. The legal standard for removal was clear. There needed to be concrete evidence of abuse or neglect. Gut feelings weren't admissible in court. His judicial oath required impartiality, not intuition. Emily knocked and entered with a fresh stack of papers. "The updated reports you requested, Your Honor," she said, placing them on his desk. "The social worker's latest evaluations." Scanning the new documents, Whitaker's frown deepened. The Smiths currently housed 5 foster children, including Brock and James. Previous records showed they'd never taken fewer than 4 at a time. The state's monthly support payments for each child were meticulously documented. "Emily," he asked, "does anything about these numbers strike you as odd?" She leaned over, studying the figures. "They're always at maximum capacity," she noted, "and the turnover rate is high." Whitaker nodded grimly. The pattern suggested the Smiths might be more interested in financial benefits than childcare, but proving it was another matter entirely. That evening in Judge Harper's office, Whitaker voiced his concerns. The older judge listened patiently, fingers steepled under his chin. "Sam," Harper said finally, "I understand your concerns, but you're walking a dangerous line here. Your job is to interpret the law, not play detective." "Daniel, something's not right with this placement," Whitaker insisted. Harper leaned forward. "If you let emotions dictate your actions, you risk your career. Be careful, Sam. We've seen good judges lose everything by getting too personally involved." The drive home that night felt longer than usual. Whitaker's grip tightened on the steering wheel as Brock's words echoed in his mind. "Please adopt us, sir." James's whispered promise, "We won't cause trouble." The streetlights blurred past as he wrestled with his conscience. His reputation, built over decades of careful adherence to judicial ethics, stood on one side. On the other, two vulnerable children whose eyes held too much pain for their young age. He knew he couldn't ignore his instincts, even if acting on them might jeopardize everything he'd worked for. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Child Services office as Whitaker straightened his tie and walked down the fluorescent-lit hallway. The familiar smell of industrial cleaner and old carpet filled the air. Judge Whitaker's chambers felt particularly solemn that morning as he waited for Rachel Green. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across his polished desk. A stack of case files sat untouched in his inbox, but his mind was focused solely on the meeting ahead. When Rachel entered, her arms wrapped around a worn manila folder that seemed ready to burst at the seams, Whitaker noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the slight dishevelment of her usually neat appearance. Her blazer was wrinkled, as if she'd spent the night at her desk. "Thank you for making the time," Rachel said, settling into the chair across from him. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had fought too many uphill battles. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands. "Tell me what the file doesn't," Whitaker said, getting straight to the point. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, ready to listen. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Rachel took a deep breath and began unfolding a story that made Whitaker's heart sink. She described how in their second foster home, James had stopped speaking entirely for 3 months after witnessing domestic violence. How Brock had developed a habit of hiding food in his pockets, a survival mechanism from a home where meals were withheld as punishment. Her voice cracked as she detailed the boys' struggles. "And now, with the Smiths," Rachel continued, her voice tight with barely contained anger, "they're just another number. The Smiths currently have 5 foster children, Your Honor. 5. They collect the checks, provide the bare necessities, and that's it." She pulled out several photographs showing a sparse bedroom with 3 sets of bunk beds crammed into a small space. No personal belongings allowed, no decorations, no love. The photos trembled in her hands as she laid them on his desk. "I've tried flagging them," she added, frustration evident in her voice. "But without concrete evidence, it's hard to act. They know exactly how to stay just within the guidelines." Rachel paused, her hands clenching into fists. "And I can't help but wonder, if Brock and James weren't black, would they have been placed in a better home by now?" The question hung heavy in the air between them. Whitaker felt his jaw tighten at the implication. "What about alternatives?" he asked, working to keep his voice steady. His pen tapped against the desk, betraying his agitation. Rachel's eyes lit up slightly. "The Johnsons. They're amazing. They've helped several traumatized children heal and thrive. They have experience with siblings, understand the importance of keeping them together." Her expression fell again. "But the system, there's so much red tape, so many hoops to jump through. Meanwhile, Brock and James deserve better than what they're getting. They deserve so much better." She clutched the folder closer to her chest like a shield. Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she gathered her documents. "These kids, they're not just case numbers to me, Your Honor. They're children who need someone to fight for them." Her voice wavered but held firm with conviction. As Rachel left his chambers, Whitaker felt a burning mix of anger and determination settle in his chest. He pulled his laptop closer, prepared to start digging into the Smiths' background himself, knowing full well the professional risks such an investigation might bring. The morning sun had shifted, leaving his office in shadows that matched his mood. The spring sunshine streamed through the windows of the child services office as Whitaker carefully carried 2 small potted plants inside. He found Brock and James waiting in the familiar meeting room, their faces brightening at the sight of him. The institutional fluorescent light seemed less harsh today, softened by the natural glow filtering through the blinds. "I brought something for you both," Whitaker said, setting the plants on the table between them. The marigold's orange-gold petals seemed to glow in the sunlight, while the succulent's pale green leaves formed a delicate rosette pattern. Each plant sat in a simple terracotta pot, earthy and warm against the sterile white table. Brock immediately reached for the marigold, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's so bright," he whispered, gently touching one of the petals. His fingers trembled slightly with excitement. James hesitated before picking up the succulent, studying its unusual shape with quiet fascination, turning the pot slowly in his hands. "Plants are easy to care for," Whitaker explained warmly. "Just like people, they need a little love and patience to grow. A bit of water, some sunlight, and they'll flourish right before your eyes." As they settled into their chairs, Brock's initial shyness melted away. "Did you know we used to have a garden?" he asked, his voice animated. "Mom and I planted flowers together. She loved daisies the most." His fingers traced the rim of the marigold's pot, around and around in a soothing motion. She said they were happy flowers because they looked like they were smiling at the sun. The memory brought a gentle smile to his face, though tinged with sadness. Whitaker noticed how Brock's eyes grew distant, lost in the memory. James, who had been silently stroking his succulent's leaves, suddenly spoke up. "I like trees," he said softly. "They're strong. They don't get hurt easily." His small hand curled protectively around the pot as he spoke. The conversation flowed naturally as they discussed different plants and gardens. Brock pulled out his sketchbook and began drawing, his pencil moving confidently across the paper. The scratching sound was oddly comforting in the quiet room. "This is the garden I want to have someday," he explained, sketching flower beds and winding paths with careful attention to detail. James leaned over, watching his brother draw before quietly picking up a pencil himself. With careful strokes, he added a tall tree to the corner of the drawing, its branches reaching toward an imaginary sky. As Whitaker observed their interaction, he felt a warmth in his chest, along with a gnawing uncertainty. The connection he was forming with these children both drew him in and made him question himself. Was he trying to make up for past mistakes? Or was this genuine care for 2 vulnerable children who had touched his heart? The question weighed heavily on him as he watched them tend to their new plants with gentle hands, their faces peaceful and focused in the afternoon light. The morning sun cast long shadows across Whitaker's desk as Rachel settled into the worn leather chair across from him, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The familiar scent of brewing coffee filled his chambers, mingling with the musty aroma of old law books, creating a comfortable atmosphere for their discussion. Dust motes danced in the early sunbeams streaming through his window. "I've been thinking about what you mentioned before," Whitaker said, taking a slow sip from his own cup, savoring the rich flavor. "About the Johnsons. Tell me more about them." Rachel's face brightened instantly, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "They're perfect," she exclaimed, pulling out their well-worn file from her bag with practiced efficiency. "They've been on the adoption list for years. Both teachers, Mark teaches high school art and runs the school's art club, and Sarah works with special needs children in elementary school. They've been hoping for children to love for so long, and they have so much to give." Whitaker spent the next hour using his judicial authority to carefully navigate the complex web of paperwork and regulations. His signature carried weight, and he wielded it carefully but decisively to move things forward, determined to make this work. Rachel worked alongside him, making calls and arranging the necessary meetings, her dedication matching his own. Later that week, Rachel organized a casual meeting at Wilson Park. The spring air was crisp and invigorating, and flowering cherry trees dotted the playground area where the twins waited nervously on a wooden bench. When the Johnsons arrived in their modest blue sedan, Brock instinctively moved closer to James, his protective instincts kicking in as he wrapped an arm around his brother's shoulders. Mark noticed Brock's sketchbook peeking out from his backpack and gently asked to see his drawings. "This garden design is incredible," he said, studying the detailed sketch with genuine interest in his eyes. "You have a real talent for perspective. The way you've layered the plants shows real understanding." Brock's shoulders relaxed slightly at the genuine compliment, a hint of pride crossing his face. "I want to build it someday," he admitted quietly, his fingers tracing the pencil lines. Sarah sat nearby on another bench, giving James space while engaging him in gentle conversation about his succulent plant, which he'd brought along in a small terracotta pot. Though James remained quiet, his usual tension seemed to ease as Sarah shared stories about her own garden and the butterfly sanctuary she'd created in their backyard. After the meeting, the Johnsons spoke with Rachel near the park entrance, their eyes bright with emotion and barely contained excitement. "They're amazing kids," Mark said earnestly, his voice thick with feeling. "We'd be honored to give them a home and help nurture their talents." Sarah nodded in agreement, wiping away a happy tear with the back of her hand. "We already love them," she added softly, clutching her husband's arm. "They feel like the missing pieces of our family." Watching from a distance, Whitaker noticed something he hadn't seen before in the twins: hope. Brock's usual wariness had softened into cautious optimism, and even James had managed a few small smiles while showing his plant to Sarah. For the first time since that day in his courtroom, Whitaker felt truly confident that these boys might finally find the stability and love they deserved. The spring breeze carried the sweet scent of new beginnings. Rachel burst into Whitaker's chambers, her face flushed and hands trembling as she clutched a manila folder. Strands of hair had come loose from her usually neat bun, betraying the urgency of her rush. "Judge, we have a serious problem," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Whitaker looked up from his desk, immediately concerned by her distress. The pen he'd been using to sign court orders slipped from his fingers. "What's wrong?" "There's been a procedural error," Rachel explained, spreading documents across his desk with shaking hands. "The biological parents' rights were never officially terminated. The paperwork was filed, but never processed. This stops everything dead in its tracks." Her fingers traced the incomplete sections of the documents, highlighting the glaring oversight. Whitaker's stomach dropped as he examined the documents. The oversight was clear, a crucial court order missing from the chain of custody. His hands felt heavy as he shuffled through the papers, searching for any solution, any legal precedent that might offer a way forward. The morning sunlight streaming through his office windows seemed to mock the darkness of the situation. Within hours, Whitaker had assembled an emergency meeting in his chambers. The court administrator, legal team, and Rachel sat around his conference table, faces grim as they discussed the implications. Coffee cups sat untouched as they pored over statute books and case files. "Without the termination order, we can't move forward with any adoption proceedings," the administrator explained, adjusting her reading glasses. "The entire process needs to be redone, properly this time. We're looking at months minimum. There's no shortcut through this." "Months?" Rachel's voice rose in disbelief, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Where will they stay? The Johnsons were ready to take them next week. They've already prepared the boys' rooms. Protocol requires they return to the group home until this is resolved," the administrator replied firmly, her expression sympathetic but unyielding. As if on cue, Whitaker's clerk entered with more bad news, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "The Smiths' attorney just filed an emergency motion for custody," she announced, handing over more paperwork, still warm from the printer. Whitaker read the motion, his jaw tightening. The Smiths claimed their established relationship with the twins made them the most suitable placement during this transition. But Whitaker knew better. The state's monthly foster care payments were likely their true motivation. He'd seen the pattern too many times before. That evening, after everyone had left, Whitaker sat alone in his chambers. The twins' file lay open before him, its contents now seeming to mock his earlier optimism. The small potted plants the twins had chosen still sat on his windowsill, a painful reminder of their growing trust and hope, now shattered by bureaucratic oversight. The succulent's shadows stretched long across his desk in the fading light. He thought of Brock's brave face crumpling when Rachel told them they had to return to the group home, and James's silent tears as he clutched his succulent plant. The older boy had tried so hard to stay strong, his fingers white-knuckled around his brother's shoulders. The system he'd served faithfully for decades now felt like a maze of red tape, threatening to trap two vulnerable children in its tangles. The weight of their disappointment pressed heavily on his conscience as night settled over the courthouse. The rain drummed steadily against the courthouse windows as Emily Carter hurried into Whitaker's chambers, her face tight with concern. Her usually neat hair was slightly disheveled from the wind outside. "Judge, you need to see this right away," she said, placing a thick legal document on his desk with trembling hands. "The Smiths have filed their custody motion." Whitaker's heart sank as he read through the paperwork, his fingers tracing the cold, formal language that could determine two young boys' fate. Within an hour, he found himself presiding over an emergency hearing, the courtroom filled with familiar faces and thick tension. The Smiths sat at the plaintiff's table, their expressions carefully composed into masks of concern, though their eyes held a calculating gleam. Their attorney, James Peterson, stood with practiced confidence adjusting his expensive tie. "Your Honor, my clients have a proven track record of providing stable homes for foster children. They've maintained all necessary certifications and have received positive reviews from the department." He gestured toward the Smiths with a flourish. Given their previous relationship with Brock and James, they represent the most logical and immediate placement option. Their home is ready to welcome the boys back today. Whitaker gripped his gavel tighter, his knuckles whitening as he watched Mrs. Smith dab at non-existent tears with a tissue. The performance made his stomach turn, and he had to force himself to maintain his judicial composure. Later that afternoon, Rachel burst into his chambers, her face flushed with anger and her eyes blazing. "Can you believe their nerve?" she fumed, pacing back and forth across the worn carpet. "They're using every loophole they can find to get those kids back. It's like they think we're all blind to what they're doing." "Tell me what you know," Whitaker said quietly, leaning forward in his chair. Rachel dropped into a chair, running her hands through her hair in frustration. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke. "It's all whispers and suspicions. Other caseworkers have noticed patterns. They always take in the maximum number of children allowed, always older kids who qualify for higher stipends, but nothing concrete enough to hold up in court. They're careful, too careful." That evening, Whitaker stayed late, his desk lamp casting long shadows as he pored over the Smiths' financial records attached to the motion. Something about the numbers didn't add up. Their reported income seemed inconsistent with their lifestyle, and there were unexplained gaps in their foster care history that nagged at his conscience. "Emily," he called out to his clerk who was preparing to leave, her coat already on. "I want you to pull every case file involving the Smiths from the past 5 years. There's something here we're missing, something that doesn't sit right." Emily nodded, understanding the urgency in his voice and immediately shrugging off her coat. As she turned to go, Whitaker added firmly, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction, "If they think they can intimidate me into handing those kids over, they've got another thing coming. We're going to find the truth, whatever it takes." The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Corner Cup Cafe as Whitaker stirred his black coffee, watching the steam rise in delicate swirls. The warm aroma filled his nostrils, a small comfort before what he knew would be a difficult conversation. Rachel sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own mug of chai tea, her wedding ring clicking softly against the ceramic. The quiet buzz of the coffee shop provided perfect cover for their conversation, with the gentle hiss of the espresso machine and murmur of other patrons creating a cocoon of privacy. "I've made a decision," Whitaker said, his voice low but determined. His fingers tightened around the warm mug. "I'm going to petition for guardianship of Brock and James." Rachel's spoon clattered against her cup, splattering tiny drops of tea onto the wooden table. "Sam, you can't be serious." Her eyes widened with concern, crow's feet deepening at the corners. The ethics committee will have a field day with this. You know what this could do to your career." "I know," Whitaker replied firmly, meeting her gaze. He leaned forward, his tie nearly dipping into his coffee. "But those kids need someone to fight for them. Really fight for them, not just within the system." Later that afternoon, the courthouse buzzed with tension as Whitaker called an emergency session. The familiar wood-paneled courtroom felt different now as he stood before it, rather than sitting behind the bench, his palms slightly damp against his suit pants. Judge Martinez, a respected colleague with streaks of gray in her dark hair, presided over the hearing. "Your Honor," Whitaker began, his voice steady despite the flutter in his stomach. He could feel dozens of eyes boring into his back. "I wish to formally petition for guardianship of Brock and James Matthews." The room erupted into whispers, the sound like leaves rustling in a storm. The Smiths' attorney, Peterson, jumped to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Objection. This is a clear conflict of interest. Judge Whitaker has been directly involved in this case from the bench. This is completely inappropriate." Whitaker turned to face the room, his shoulders square, chin lifted with resolve. "This is about the welfare of two children, not politics or procedure. I've witnessed firsthand their struggle for stability and love. They deserve better than being pawns in a system that's failing them." Judge Martinez called for order, her gavel echoing through the chamber like a thunderclap. "Mr. Peterson, your objection is noted. However, I will allow Judge Whitaker's petition to proceed." She fixed Whitaker with a stern look, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Be advised, Sam. This will bring intense scrutiny to both you and this court." That evening, Whitaker sat in his living room, the leather of his armchair creaking as he watched Channel 5 News. The anchor's voice filled the room. In an unprecedented move, Family Court Judge Samuel Whitaker has petitioned for guardianship of two foster children, raising questions about judicial ethics and professional boundaries. Critics are calling it a dangerous blurring of lines. He switched off the TV with a sharp click, knowing he'd stepped into a storm but feeling more certain than ever about his decision. The house felt emptier than usual, but he could already picture it filled with the sounds of two young boys finding their way home. Camera flashes burst like lightning as Whitaker made his way up the courthouse steps. Reporters clustered around him, their voices overlapping in an urgent chorus, microphones thrust forward like accusing fingers. "Judge Whitaker, why risk your career for these children? Is this a political statement about the foster system? Have you ever done anything like this before? Are you planning to adopt the twins yourself?" Whitaker kept his head high, pushing through the crowd with as much dignity as he could muster. His perfectly pressed suit felt like armor against their probing questions. "No comment," he repeated firmly, though each question stung like a paper cut, leaving invisible wounds on his conscience. Inside the courthouse, the scrutiny didn't let up. Colleagues who normally greeted him warmly now averted their eyes or whispered behind cupped hands. The marble halls that once felt like home now seemed cold and unwelcoming. Judge Daniel Harper, his mentor of 20 years, cornered him near the water cooler, his weathered face creased with concern. "Sam?" Harper's voice was heavy with disappointment, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. "This isn't like you. You've always been the voice of reason, the steady hand. You're jeopardizing everything you've worked for. Your reputation, your position, everything." Before Whitaker could respond, he was called into the main conference room for his disciplinary hearing. 5 stern faces waited behind a long mahogany table, the judicial board members who would decide his fate. The room felt smaller than he remembered, more confining. "Judge Whitaker," began Justice Reynolds, her glasses perched low on her nose, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Your actions raise serious concerns about your ability to remain impartial. How can you justify this clear departure from judicial ethics?" Whitaker sat straight in his chair, his hands folded on the table, fighting to keep his voice steady. "With all due respect, I couldn't stand by and let these children be placed in a harmful situation. Sometimes doing what's right means stepping outside our comfort zones. The law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to bind our hands when they need us most." The questioning continued for hours, each minute feeling like an eternity under the harsh fluorescent lights. They picked apart his decisions, his interactions with the twins, his handling of the Smiths case. Their questions felt like arrows, precise and targeted. Meanwhile, across town, Rachel was working the phones, reaching out to every contact she had. Former caseworkers, past foster children, anyone who might have information about the Smiths. As darkness fell, Whitaker's phone buzzed. Rachel's name flashed on the screen, a beacon of hope in the growing shadows. "I think I've found something," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "But it's not enough to take to court yet. We need more time." Whitaker leaned back in his office chair, feeling the weight of the day settling onto his shoulders. The disciplinary hearing, the disappointed faces, the reporters, it all pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. Through his window, he could see the city lights beginning to twinkle, reminding him that somewhere out there, 2 young lives hung in the balance. The morning sun filtered through Whitaker's kitchen windows as Rachel spread documents across his dining table. Steam rose from their untouched coffee mugs as they pored over paper after paper, their focus intense on the growing stack of evidence before them. "Look at these numbers," Rachel said, pointing to a series of expense reports with her perfectly manicured finger. "The Smiths claim they spent $800 on school supplies for 1 month, but the receipts don't match up. They're padding everything: food costs, clothing allowances, medical expenses. Some of these numbers are nearly double what they should be." Whitaker leaned in, adjusting his reading glasses as he squinted at the small print. "It's suspicious, but proving financial fraud isn't enough to stop them from getting custody of Brock and James. We need something more substantial, something that shows direct impact on the children." Rachel pulled out another folder, this one worn at the edges and stuffed with papers. "I found something else. An email thread from Marcus, one of their former foster kids." She handed Whitaker a printed conversation, the pages slightly crumpled from frequent handling. He was with them 3 years ago, right before they moved to this district. As Whitaker read, his jaw tightened and a muscle twitched in his cheek. Marcus described sleeping on a bare mattress in an unheated basement, sharing the cramped space with 3 other foster children. He wrote about going hungry while the Smiths claimed full food allowances, about being left alone for days while they took expensive vacations to warm beaches. "Will he testify?" Whitaker asked, hope rising in his voice as he looked up from the disturbing account. Rachel shook her head, her expression grim. "He's scared. Says he doesn't want to relive it all. The trauma's still too fresh." She rubbed her temples, exhaustion evident in her movements. "But there must be others. The Smiths have fostered over 30 children in the past decade. Someone must be willing to speak up." They spent the next few hours combing through records, building a detailed timeline of the Smiths' fostering history. Rachel discovered multiple instances of forged signatures on school documents and medical forms. Some reports showed different handwriting claiming to be from the same doctor, the inconsistencies obvious once they knew what to look for. "The court date's in 12 days, Whitaker said, checking his watch and noting the late afternoon sun. "We need something concrete before then, something that will convince Judge Martinez to deny their petition." Rachel gathered her papers, organizing them into neat piles with practiced efficiency. "I'll reach out to more former foster kids. Someone has to be willing to speak up." She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. "We'll find it, Sam. We have to. Those boys deserve better." After she left, Whitaker remained at his dining table, staring at the twins' file. The photograph clipped to the front showed their serious faces, eyes holding too much wisdom for such young children. Both boys looked straight at the camera, their expressions guarded but hopeful. "We're getting closer," he muttered to himself, determined to find the evidence they needed to protect them. "Just hold on a little longer, boys." The group home's harsh fluorescent lights cast unyielding shadows in the small, bare-bones room where Brock and James sat in somber silence. Their twin beds, pushed against opposite walls, were adorned with identical gray blankets, the only splash of color coming from Brock's treasured bracelet made from his mother's hair. The heavy air was thick with their unspoken anguish. Whitaker knocked gently before entering, carrying a brown paper bag and 2 wrapped packages. "How are my 2 favorite people doing today?" he asked, forcing an upbeat tone that fell flat when neither boy responded. James continued methodically sketching spirals in his notebook, while Brock stared numbly at the wall, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Setting down his gifts, Whitaker pulled up a plastic chair between their beds. "I brought some chocolate chip cookies, the soft kind you like, Brock. And James, there's those sour gummy worms you enjoyed last time." The mention of their favorite treats elicited no reaction, as Brock's fingers absently twisted the bracelet on his wrist, and James's pencil moved mechanically across the paper, creating dark, jagged patterns. After several minutes of heavy silence, Brock finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Why is it so hard to just be happy? Every time we think things are getting better, something bad happens." The question hung in the air, laced with profound pain and frustration. James lifted his head slightly, adding in an even quieter voice, "Maybe it's our fault. Maybe we're just not meant to have a family." His pencil stilled on the paper, leaving an unfinished line. Whitaker immediately moved to kneel between their beds, his knees protesting against the hard floor. "Listen to me, both of you," he said firmly, looking from one boy to the other. "None of this is your fault. Not one bit of it. You deserve a home, and I promise I'll do everything I can to make that happen." The visit continued with small talk and gentle encouragement, but the boys' spirits remained low. When it was time to leave, Whitaker hugged them both, promising to return soon. Brock held on a moment longer than usual, while James gave a barely perceptible squeeze back. Back in his car, Whitaker gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the full weight of their despair. Their pain and profound sense of hopelessness fueled his determination to fight harder, to find a way through the maddening bureaucracy and corruption that stood in the way of the boys finding the loving home they so desperately deserved. The boardroom's mahogany walls seemed to close in as Whitaker sat before his peers. Sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the long table where 5 senior judges sat in stern silence, their faces etched with gravity. The air felt thick with tension, heavy with the weight of judgment and expectation. The Smiths' attorney, Mr. Davidson, stood at the podium, his voice dripping with practiced indignation. His perfectly pressed suit and polished shoes spoke of careful preparation for this moment. Judge Whitaker's actions show a complete disregard for judicial impartiality. His personal involvement with these children has compromised his ability to make unbiased decisions. We cannot allow emotion to override proper judicial conduct. Whitaker's hands remained steady in his lap, though his heart raced beneath his carefully composed exterior. He'd prepared his defense carefully, spending sleepless nights organizing his thoughts, ready to explain why protecting Brock and James mattered more than protocol. Just as he rose to speak, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, the sound echoing through the hushed room. A young woman in her mid-20s stepped into the room, her shoulders squared, despite her obvious nervousness. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, but her hands shook as she clutched a worn manila folder, its edges frayed from years of handling. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice wavering but determined. "But I need to speak. It's about the children." The board chairman frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "Young lady, this is a closed hearing. My name is Teresa Morales," she continued, stepping forward with growing confidence. "I lived with the Smiths for 18 months when I was 14. Her words carried the weight of painful memories, each one etched in her expression. "What they did to me, to all of us, it can't happen to anyone else. I won't let it." The room fell silent as Teresa described her time in the Smiths' home. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of cold nights without proper blankets, while the Smiths bought new furniture for their living room. Of hungry afternoons when food was locked away in cabinets they couldn't reach. Of watching younger children cry themselves to sleep while the Smiths ignored their distress, turning up the volume on their television. "They cared more about the checks than about us," Teresa said, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. She opened her folder, pulling out faded photographs and printed emails, each one a piece of damning evidence. "I kept everything. The receipts showing they claimed expenses for things we never got. The emails where Mrs. Smith complained about having to waste money on proper food. I even have pictures of the locked cabinets and empty rooms they claimed were furnished." The board members leaned forward, examining the evidence Teresa presented with growing concern. Page after page of documented neglect painted a clear picture of the Smiths' true nature. Mr. Davidson's face grew increasingly pale as Teresa's testimony continued, his earlier confidence crumbling with each new revelation. After careful consideration and hushed discussions, the board chairman announced they would admit Teresa's testimony into the official record. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically from skepticism to shocked understanding. When the hearing concluded, Whitaker found Teresa in the hallway, where sunlight streamed through tall windows. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion and gratitude. Teresa gave a small, sad smile, shadows of her past visible in her eyes. "I couldn't let those kids go through what I did." She clutched her now empty folder to her chest like a shield. It wasn't easy coming back here, facing all this again, but someone had to speak up. Those boys deserve better. Whitaker walked down the courthouse steps into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the first real glimmer of hope since this battle began. The warmth on his face matched the growing warmth in his heart. Teresa's testimony could change everything. Finally, the truth about the Smiths would be known. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Whitaker took his place at the witness stand. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air. Every seat was filled, reporters with notepads poised, child services workers clutching thick files bound in manila folders, and concerned community members who'd heard about the case through local news and neighborhood gossip. Whitaker's voice carried clear and strong through the room, echoing slightly off the wood-paneled walls. "I won't deny that I care deeply for these children," he said, meeting the presiding judge's gaze with unwavering conviction. "But this is not about me. This is about ensuring their safety and well-being, about giving them the stable foundation every child deserves." He smoothed his tie, a nervous habit from his early days as a lawyer that still surfaced in moments of deep emotion, and continued. "I've watched Brock nurture a small marigold plant, treating it with such gentleness, watering it each morning without fail. I've seen James slowly emerge from his shell, finding courage to share his beautiful artwork with not just me, but others in the household." His voice softened with emotion. "These aren't just case numbers to me anymore. They're children who deserve better than what they've been given, children who've shown remarkable strength in the face of unimaginable challenges." Drawing a deep breath, Whitaker addressed his own past, his shoulders squared against the weight of the memory. 20 years ago, I made a decision that resulted in tragedy. A child died because I followed procedure instead of my conscience, because I chose paperwork over human compassion. His hands gripped the stand until his knuckles whitened. I've carried that weight every day since. But these boys, they've taught me that sometimes doing what's right means taking a stand, even when it costs you everything you've worked for. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as Whitaker described the twins' resilience, every eye fixed on his earnest face. Despite everything they've endured, they still hope. They still dream of a garden to call their own, of a place where they feel safe enough to put down roots. His voice cracked slightly, heavy with emotion. I made mistakes in the past, but I won't make the same mistake again. These children deserve a chance to heal, to grow, and to be loved unconditionally, something every child should have from the start. As Whitaker stepped down from the stand, his polished shoes squeaking softly against the floor, his eyes found Brock and James in the back row. Brock's small smile and James's quiet nod filled him with renewed purpose, their trust in him both humbling and strengthening. In that moment, regardless of the outcome, he knew he'd done the right thing, following his heart instead of just the letter of the law. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the courthouse steps as Whitaker climbed them one by one. His polished shoes clicked against the marble, each step measured and deliberate. Despite his pristine appearance, freshly pressed suit and perfectly knotted tie, his hands trembled slightly as he checked his watch for the third time. The weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Rachel stood waiting in the hallway, her familiar face a comfort in the tension-filled morning. Her own eyes reflected the worry they all felt. "Whatever happens," she said, squeezing his shoulder, "You fought the good fight, Sam." Her warm smile helped steady his nerves, and he managed a small nod of gratitude. Inside the courtroom, the wood-paneled walls seemed to close in as people filed into their seats. The air felt thick with anticipation. The Smiths sat rigidly on one side, their attorney shuffling papers nervously, occasionally whispering in their ears. Whitaker caught glimpses of Brock and James being led in by their social worker, their small faces tight with anxiety. James clutched his brother's hand so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The judge, a seasoned veteran named Margaret Chen, began methodically reviewing the evidence. Her voice carried clearly as she referenced Teresa's testimony, the financial discrepancies, and the pattern of complaints against the Smiths. Each point landed like a hammer strike in the hushed room. The scratching of the court reporter's keyboard provided a steady backdrop to her words. Turning to address the Smiths, Judge Chen's voice took on a stern edge. "The evidence before this court reveals a disturbing pattern," she declared, her gaze unwavering as she peered over her reading glasses. "Your financial records show multiple instances of misrepresentation, and the testimony regarding your treatment of foster children is deeply troubling." The Smiths seemed to shrink in their seats as she continued. "Your actions have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that is incompatible with the responsibilities of foster care." Mrs. Smith dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while her husband stared straight ahead. When she turned to Whitaker, her expression softened slightly. "Judge Whitaker, while your methods have raised eyebrows, your dedication to these children's welfare is undeniable." She paused, adjusting her glasses and allowing her next words to carry their full weight. "In light of the evidence presented, I find that granting guardianship to Judge Whitaker is in the best interest of the children." The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs, the sound swelling like a wave. Rachel squeezed Whitaker's arm as tears welled in his eyes, a few escaping down his cheeks despite his best efforts. Across the room, Brock and James sat frozen as if afraid to believe what they'd heard, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning hope. As soon as the judge concluded the hearing, the twins broke free from their social worker and raced toward Whitaker, their footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Their small bodies crashed into him with the force of their emotion, arms wrapping tightly around his waist. Brock looked up, tears streaming down his face, his voice trembling. "Does this mean we're a family now?" Whitaker knelt down, pulling both boys close, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and feeling their small hearts racing against his chest. "Yes," he answered, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "We're a family." The morning sunlight streamed through Whitaker's bedroom window, casting a warm glow across his face. For the first time in years, he woke without the weight of worry pressing down on his chest. The house was quiet, but different somehow, filled with possibility and promise. Even the air seemed fresher, charged with the anticipation of new beginnings. He spent the morning making final preparations, straightening picture frames and double-checking the rooms he'd prepared. His hands traced the edge of Brock's new desk, imagining the artwork that would soon cover its surface. In James's room, he adjusted the carefully arranged books one last time, making sure each spine aligned perfectly. He'd chosen them specifically for James's interests: art books, nature guides, and stories about finding courage. At precisely 2 o'clock, Whitaker pulled up to the group home. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the twins waiting on the front steps, their small bags packed beside them. Brock was practically bouncing with excitement, his hands fidgeting with the friendship bracelet on his wrist, while James sat still, clutching his worn sketchpad like a shield. Their social worker stood nearby, smiling warmly at the scene. "You're really taking us home?" Brock asked as he climbed into the back seat, his voice filled with wonder as he clicked his seatbelt into place. His eyes darted around the car's interior, taking in every detail as if memorizing it. "Yes, sweetheart. Home," Whitaker replied, his smile reflected in the rearview mirror. The word felt rich and full on his tongue. When they pulled into the driveway, both boys stared wide-eyed at the modest 2-story house. Though not extravagant, its red brick walls and white trim spoke of stability and warmth. The garden beds were freshly mulched, ready for new plantings. Inside, Brock gasped at the sight of the professional watercolor set arranged on his desk. while James ran his fingers gently along the spines of his new books, a tiny smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Over a dinner of homemade lasagna, Whitaker shared his plans for the future. "I've been thinking," he said, twirling pasta on his fork, "about retiring early. I want to spend more time with you both, and maybe start a non-profit to help other kids in foster care. There are so many children who need someone in their corner." "Can we help?" Brock asked eagerly, tomato sauce dotting his chin. His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm at the idea. "Of course," Whitaker assured him, passing a napkin. "You'll be part of everything we do. Your experiences and ideas will be invaluable." After dinner, they settled onto the plush living room couch, the fabric soft and welcoming against their backs. Whitaker pulled out a leather-bound photo album, its pages still mostly empty but ready to be filled with new memories. Brock leaned against his shoulder, pointing at the few photos already placed inside. Pictures from their supervised visits and the day in court. Each image captured moments of growing trust and connection. As evening settled in, Brock's eyes grew heavy, his excitement finally giving way to exhaustion. Whitaker scooped him up, carrying him to his new room and tucking him under the soft blue comforter. James followed shortly after, climbing into his own bed with his sketch pad still close by, his security blanket in this new chapter of life. As Whitaker turned to leave, James's quiet voice stopped him at the door. "Thanks, Dad." The word hung in the air like a precious gift, and Whitaker felt his heart swell with emotion. It was more than just a word. It was a promise, a beginning, a dream finally coming true. The spring breeze carried the fresh scent of paint across the yard as Whitaker, Brock, and James worked together on their fence. White paint gleamed in the morning sun as they carefully covered each wooden slat. Brock's enthusiasm showed in his quick, energetic brush strokes, while James took his time, making sure every spot was perfectly covered, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "You know," Brock said thoughtfully, dipping his brush into the paint can and wiping the excess on the rim, "this feels like something a real family would do." His words hung in the air, full of meaning, and his eyes sparkled with hope. Whitaker smiled warmly, his heart swelling with affection. "That's because we are a real family, son." As they continued painting, Whitaker described his vision for their backyard garden, his paintbrush sweeping through the air like a conductor's baton. "We could put flower beds along the fence," he suggested, gesturing with his paintbrush. "And maybe some vegetables too. Tomatoes, cucumbers, whatever you boys would like to grow." "Can we plant daisies?" Brock asked eagerly, paint dripping from his brush onto his old sneakers. "Mom always said they were happy flowers. She used to keep them in a mason jar on our kitchen windowsill." James, who had been quietly painting, looked up from his careful work. "I'd like to plant a tree," he said softly, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "Maybe an oak? They grow really tall and strong, and birds could build nests in it." Their peaceful work was occasionally interrupted by friendly neighbors stopping to introduce themselves. Mrs. Johnson from next door, a grandmother type with silver hair, brought over homemade chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven, and the Petersons across the street welcomed them warmly to the neighborhood, their young daughter shyly peeking from behind her mother's legs. Brock waved enthusiastically at each visitor, while James stayed close to Whitaker, offering shy smiles from the safety of his new father's presence, gradually relaxing as each interaction proved safe and friendly. The morning wore on pleasantly until Brock, in his excitement to reach a high spot, accidentally knocked over his paint can. White paint splashed across his shoes and the grass, creating a Jackson Pollock-like pattern on the green lawn. For a moment, everyone froze. Then Brock's surprised expression set them all laughing. Even James joined in, his quiet chuckle mixing with Whitaker's deep laugh and Brock's infectious giggle, the sound echoing across their front yard. The sound of their shared laughter seemed to bring the house to life, filling it with warmth and joy that had been missing for so long. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their freshly painted fence, they sat together on the porch steps to admire their work, tired but satisfied with their day's accomplishment. Brock leaned against Whitaker's shoulder, paint still speckled on his clothes and a few drops dried in his hair. "We're finally home," he whispered, his voice full of contentment and belonging. Whitaker nodded, wrapping an arm around both boys and pulling them close, feeling the truth of those words deep in his heart. The painted fence stood as a symbol of their first day as a real family, white and pristine in the golden evening light. The aroma of slightly charred bread wafted through the house as Whitaker made his way downstairs, the familiar scent bringing a smile to his face despite the obvious cooking mishap. He found Brock standing on his tiptoes at the counter, frantically trying to scrape black bits off several pieces of toast with the butter knife. The boy's face lit up instantly when he saw Whitaker, his earlier frustration melting away. "Good morning, Dad," Brock called out cheerfully, despite the breakfast mishap. "I wanted to surprise you with breakfast, but—" He gestured helplessly at the burnt toast, his shoulders slumping slightly with disappointment. James was quietly arranging plates and forks at the kitchen table, his movements more assured than they had been 2 weeks ago. His careful attention to detail showed in the perfectly aligned silverware. He gave Whitaker a small smile and continued his task, making sure each place setting was just right. "That's very thoughtful of you both," Whitaker said, ruffling Brock's hair as he passed by the counter. "How about we make some fresh toast together? I'll show you my secret for getting it just right." Their mornings fell into a comfortable pattern that felt as natural as breathing. Whitaker would help the boys pack their backpacks, double-checking homework and lunchboxes while sharing gentle reminders about afternoon activities. The walk to the bus stop became their special time together, with Brock chattering excitedly about his dreams for their garden, while James listened intently, occasionally adding his own quiet observations about the birds and changing leaves. During the day, while the boys were at school, Whitaker worked diligently at his desk, researching successful nonprofits and drafting proposals. He wanted to create something meaningful that would help other foster children find their forever homes, just as his boys had found theirs. His notes grew more detailed with each passing day. Evenings were filled with cooking adventures and laughter. Brock had appointed himself chief kitchen experimenter, proudly presenting dishes that weren't always successful, but were made with boundless enthusiasm and love. James preferred to help with cleanup, methodically washing dishes while Brock dried them, their teamwork growing stronger each day as they developed their own rhythm. "Dad," Brock said one sunny afternoon, holding up a well-worn gardening magazine, "can we plant some flowers to make the house feel more like ours? I was thinking maybe some yellow ones by the front door." James looked uncertain at first, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, but when Whitaker suggested they could include a strong oak tree in their garden plans, his eyes brightened with interest, and a hint of excitement crept into his expression. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, Whitaker sat on the porch with his notebook, watching his sons sprawled on their stomachs in the grass. They were drawing elaborate garden designs, complete with winding paths and hidden corners perfect for reading or drawing. James carefully sketched the oak tree with precise strokes while Brock added vibrant splashes of color for the flower beds, their creative energy flowing freely. Watching them work together, Whitaker felt a deep warmth spread through his chest. The house that had once felt too quiet and empty now hummed with life and possibility. His sons were finally home, and together they were building something beautiful. The sound of distressed whimpers pierced the quiet night. Whitaker jolted awake, his heart racing as he recognized James's cries. He rushed down the hallway to the boys' room, finding James tangled in his sheets, his small body shaking. "James, sweetheart," Whitaker called softly. Sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, he placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "You're safe now. I'm here." James's eyes flew open, wild with fear, until they focused on Whitaker's face. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he struggled to catch his breath. "It's okay," Whitaker soothed, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're home. You're safe." The next morning, while James was getting dressed, Brock lingered in the kitchen, pushing his cereal around the bowl. His usual cheerful demeanor was subdued. "Dad?" he asked hesitantly. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course, buddy. Anything." "Sometimes," Brock's voice wavered. "Sometimes I get scared that this isn't going to last. Every time we thought we found a home before, something went wrong. They always sent us away." Whitaker's heart ached at the fear in Brock's voice. He knelt beside his chair, meeting his eyes. "This is different, Brock. This is permanent. No one is taking you away again. I promise." Over the following days, Whitaker worked tirelessly to prove his words true. He established comforting routines: morning hugs before school, afternoon snacks at the kitchen table, bedtime stories that never got skipped. For James's nightmares, he installed a soft nightlight that cast gentle stars across the ceiling. With Brock, he spent extra time in the evenings, listening to his stories and plans, showing him through consistent attention that his place in the family was secure. One particularly difficult evening, after James had struggled to fall asleep for hours, Whitaker sat on the edge of his bed. The boy's eyes were red from crying, his hands clutching his blanket tightly. "James," Whitaker said softly, his voice filled with conviction, "I want you to know something. No one will ever hurt you again." James's grip on the blanket slowly loosened as his eyes grew heavy. Whitaker stayed, watching over him until his breathing evened out in peaceful sleep. As he quietly closed the door, he reflected on the challenges of becoming a father. The path wouldn't be easy, but his commitment to these boys ran deeper than any difficulty they might face. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the kitchen floor as Whitaker finished cleaning up breakfast dishes. He turned to the twins with a smile. "I've got a surprise planned for today. We're going to the nursery to pick out plants for our garden." Brock's face lit up instantly, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Really? Can we get flowers and vegetables and—" Even James perked up at the news, a small but genuine smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The local nursery was a wonderland of colors and scents. Row after row of plants stretched before them, delicate flowers in every shade imaginable, sturdy vegetables ready for planting, and young trees reaching toward the sky. Brock darted ahead, practically bouncing between the aisles, while James stayed close to Whitaker, his hand occasionally brushing against his new father's sleeve. "Look at these," Brock called out, pointing to a display of cheerful daisies. Their white petals seemed to glow in the morning light. "Mom always said daisies were happy flowers. Can we get some?" "Of course," Whitaker nodded, watching as Brock carefully selected the healthiest-looking plants. James moved more slowly through the nursery, studying each plant with quiet intensity. He paused in front of a row of saplings, reaching out to touch one's leaves with gentle fingers. "Would you like that one?" Whitaker asked softly. James nodded. "A tree will grow strong like us," he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with meaning. They added more plants to their cart, some fragrant herbs for cooking, colorful marigolds that Brock insisted would make the butterflies happy, and a few sturdy vegetables. James held his sapling carefully as they loaded everything into the car, while Brock chatted excitedly about where each plant should go in their yard. Back home, they spent the afternoon preparing the soil and planting their new garden. Whitaker showed them how to dig holes the right size, how to carefully remove plants from their containers, and how to pack soil around delicate roots. "The key is giving them what they need to thrive," he explained, demonstrating how to water the newly planted flowers. Sunshine, water, and lots of love. As they stood back to admire their work, the garden glowing in the late afternoon light, Brock looked up at Whitaker with eyes that seemed older than his years. "Mom would have liked this," he said softly. Whitaker placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "She'd be so proud of both of you." James nodded silently beside them, his hand resting on the trunk of his newly planted sapling, and for the first time since they'd become a family, a profound sense of peace settled over all three of them. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Whitaker helped the twins prepare for their first day at their new school. Brock stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, smoothing down his bright yellow dress for the 10th time. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he twirled around. "Do you think the other kids will like me?" he asked, adjusting his backpack straps. "Of course they will, sweetheart," Whitaker replied, packing their lunchboxes. Meanwhile, James sat quietly at the kitchen table, pushing his cereal around with his spoon. He wore his usual oversized hoodie, almost disappearing into the fabric. His sketchpad was clutched tightly under his arm, like a shield. "Everything okay, James?" Whitaker asked gently. James shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "Just nervous," he mumbled. "That's perfectly normal," Whitaker assured him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember, if either of you needs anything at all, just let the teacher know and they'll call me right away." At the school drop-off, other parents and children streamed past them toward the entrance. Brock gave Whitaker a quick hug before joining the flow of students, his yellow dress bright against the sea of backpacks. James hung back, his fingers white-knuckled around his sketchpad. His eyes darted nervously between the school entrance and Whitaker. "I'll be right here when school ends," Whitaker promised, kneeling down to James's level. "Same spot, okay?" James nodded slightly and took a deep breath before walking slowly into the building. Around midday, Whitaker's phone rang. It was the school counselor, Ms. Martinez. She reported that Brock had already made friends with several classmates and actively participated in morning discussions. However, her voice grew concerned as she described James's behavior. "He's having trouble integrating," she explained. "During group activities, he sits alone and draws in his notebook. He hasn't spoken to any of his classmates." When Whitaker pulled up to the school that afternoon, Brock bounded out first, practically bursting with stories. "Dad, I made 3 new friends already. And my teacher, Ms. Thompson, she loves art too. And guess what? They have a garden club here," he exclaimed as he climbed into the car. James followed more slowly, sliding into the back seat without a word. He stared out the window, his sketchpad hugged tightly to his chest. That evening after dinner, Whitaker found James sitting alone on the back porch. He sat down beside him, not speaking at first, just sharing the quiet moment. Finally, James spoke softly. "It's hard being the new kid. I just don't know what to say to anyone." "I know it's tough," Whitaker responded warmly. "But you'll find your way. One step at a time." Whitaker's fingers trembled slightly as he held the weathered envelope. The return address, written in faded blue ink, belonged to Sarah Mitchell, the mother whose case had shaped his entire career. He hadn't thought about this letter in years, tucked away in his filing cabinet like the memories he'd tried to suppress. Taking a deep breath, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thin, covered in neat handwriting that spoke of careful consideration. "Dear Judge Whitaker," it began, "I know you might be surprised to hear from me. I've thought long and hard about writing this letter. Despite everything that happened, I want you to know that I understand you tried your best to help us. The system failed my children, but you weren't the one who failed them. You were the only one who saw us as people, not just case numbers." Whitaker's vision blurred as he continued reading. "Please don't stop fighting for children like mine. They need someone like you, someone who sees their humanity, who fights for their best interests. Maybe someday you'll be able to make the changes that could have saved my family." When Brock and James came home from school, Whitaker called them into his office. He showed them the letter, watching as Brock read it aloud, his voice growing softer with each word. "She sounds like she really believed in you," Brock said, looking up at Whitaker with understanding beyond his years. James, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Maybe this is why we found you," he said softly, "so you could help other kids too." That evening, Whitaker sat at his desk, surrounded by notes and ideas. He began writing the mission statement for his nonprofit. Every child deserves a home, love, and a chance to thrive. The words flowed easily now, carrying the weight of Sarah's trust and the hope he saw in Brock and James's eyes. Rachel's car pulled into Whitaker's driveway just as the evening sun cast long shadows across the front yard. Before she could even reach for her purse, Brock burst through the front door, waving enthusiastically. "Miss Rachel, you have to see my room and the garden," Brock called out, practically bouncing with excitement. James stood in the doorway, offering a shy but genuine smile. Come on. Brock grabbed Rachel's hand, leading her inside while Whitaker watched, amused at his enthusiasm. The twins gave Rachel the grand tour, showing off their personalized spaces. Brock's room was adorned with colorful artwork, and the watercolor set displayed proudly on his desk. James's room featured his growing collection of books and a special corner for drawing. And look what we planted. Brock led Rachel to the window overlooking the backyard garden. Those are Mom's favorite daisies, and James picked out that tree. After a warm dinner of lasagna, Brock's new specialty, they gathered in the living room. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a thick scrapbook bound in blue fabric. "I've been keeping this for you both," she said softly, placing it on the coffee table. "It's your journey." The twins settled on either side of Rachel as she opened the book. Inside were photographs spanning years, Brock and James at various ages, in different homes, always together. There were case notes, carefully selected to show positive moments, and letters from teachers and caregivers who had seen their potential. "Look how tiny we were," Brock marveled, pointing to a photo of them at their first foster placement. James traced his finger over a familiar drawing visible in one of the pictures. "I remember making that," he said quietly. "It was right after we met you, Miss Rachel." Rachel cleared her throat, shifting slightly. "I also wanted to update you about the Smiths," she said, looking at Whitaker. "We've collected enough evidence of financial fraud. Their foster care license is being revoked and they're facing charges." Whitaker nodded, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and determination. The Smiths' case was important, but it was just one piece of a larger puzzle that needed solving. Rachel stayed until the sky darkened outside, sharing stories and memories with the twins. When she finally stood to leave, both Brock and James hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you both," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Look how far you've come." From the porch, Whitaker watched Rachel's taillights disappear down the street. The sound of laughter drew his attention to the garden, where Brock and James were examining their newly planted flowers in the evening light. He felt immensely grateful for Rachel's dedication to the twins, knowing her support had helped make this moment possible. Rain drummed steadily against the windows as Brock and James sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by art supplies. Whitaker sat in his favorite armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through a novel. The peaceful afternoon atmosphere was broken by Brock's sudden outburst. "James, where's my special blue marker?" Brock's voice rose with frustration as he rifled through his supplies. "You were the last one using it." James looked up from his drawing, his shoulders tensing. "No, I wasn't. You had it yesterday." "You're always losing things," Brock snapped, his face flushing with anger. "Every time I let you borrow something, it disappears." James threw down his pencil, his usual quiet demeanor cracking. "Maybe if you didn't boss me around all the time, I wouldn't mess up so much." The argument escalated quickly, years of pent-up emotions bubbling to the surface. Brock stood up, hands clenched at his sides. "I had to take care of us when no one else did," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Someone had to make sure we were okay." James jumped to his feet, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't ask you to. You're not Mom." Whitaker set his book aside and approached the twins calmly. "Let's take a break," he suggested gently, guiding Brock to the window seat while directing James to the couch. The boys turned away from each other, both wiping at their eyes. Whitaker spent time with each of them separately. In the kitchen, Brock confessed in whispers, "I'm scared something will happen and we'll be separated. I've always had to watch out for him." Later, in the study, James admitted quietly, "Sometimes I feel like I'm just trouble for everyone. Like Brock would be better off without having to worry about me all the time." As evening approached, Brock found James still sitting on the couch. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have yelled at you." James nodded. "I'm sorry too. I know you're just trying to help." They talked quietly, sharing fears and memories, promising to stay together no matter what. The rain began to clear and the twins sat side by side at the window, sharing a soft blanket Whitaker had brought them. They each had their sketchbooks out, drawing quietly together as the last raindrops fell. Whitaker watched from his chair, heart full as he witnessed their bond growing stronger through the storm. A week had passed since the twins' argument, and Whitaker found himself staring at an invitation to speak at a local foster care reform event. He sat at the kitchen table, reading it for the third time when Rachel stopped by. "You should do it," she said, noticing his hesitation. "Your story could inspire real change. Brock, who had been listening from the doorway, rushed in. "Yeah, Dad, you have to." His enthusiasm was contagious, and even James nodded encouragingly from behind his brother. The morning of the event, Brock insisted on helping Whitaker choose his outfit. "This one," he declared, pulling out a bright blue tie. "It's hopeful, like the sky after rain." The simple wisdom in his words touched Whitaker deeply. At the community center, Whitaker sat in his parked car, going over his index cards one more time. His hands trembled slightly as he read through the bullet points he'd carefully prepared. The modest building before him was filled with foster parents, social workers, and advocates, people who knew the system's challenges intimately. When called to speak, Whitaker approached the podium, his heart thundering in his chest. Looking out at the sea of faces, he took a deep breath and began sharing his story. He spoke about meeting Brock and James, their courage in asking for help, and how they had changed his life forever. "I've seen the flaws in our system firsthand," he said, his voice growing stronger. "But I've also seen the hope that comes from giving children the love and stability they deserve." He described his plans for the nonprofit, emphasizing the need for systemic change and community support. His words struck a chord. Many in the audience nodded in understanding, some wiping away tears. When he finished, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. People lined up afterward to offer their support. Local business owners pledging donations, retired teachers volunteering their time, and fellow foster parents sharing their own stories. Back home that evening, Brock and James were waiting up, eager to hear about the event. When Whitaker described the positive response, Brock's face lit up with pride. "Told you the tie would work," he said with a grin, making James giggle softly beside him. The morning sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange as Whitaker loaded the twins into the car. He had kept the surprise destination secret all week, enjoying how Brock peppered him with endless questions while James listened intently, trying to piece together the clues. "Are we there yet?" Brock asked for the 10th time, practically vibrating with anticipation in his seat. "Almost," Whitaker chuckled, catching James's curious glance in the rearview mirror. When they pulled into the amusement park parking lot, Brock's eyes went wide. "No way," he squealed, pressing his face against the window. James sat up straighter, his expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. The entrance to the park was a sensory explosion. Carnival music drifted through the air, mixing with delighted screams from the rides. The smell of buttered popcorn and cotton candy wafted around them. Colorful balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze, and mascots in bright costumes waved to passing children. "Where should we start?" Whitaker asked, handing each twin a park map. "The teacups." Brock pointed enthusiastically to a whirling ride decorated with oversized porcelain cups painted in pastel colors. James hung back slightly, clutching his ever-present sketchpad like a shield. They started with gentler attractions, a carousel with hand-painted horses, a slow-moving train that circled the park, and a fun house with silly mirrors. James began to relax, even laughing at his distorted reflection. When they reached the teacup ride, Brock grabbed Whitaker's hand and pulled him toward the line. "Come on, Dad. You have to spin with me." James found a nearby bench, content to watch and sketch the scene before him. The ride operator secured them in a blue and white cup, and soon they were spinning wildly, Brock's laughter ringing out above the music. Whitaker felt slightly dizzy but couldn't help joining in the infectious joy. After a few more rides, Whitaker noticed James watching a small roller coaster with interest. "Want to try it?" he asked gently. James hesitated, then nodded. "I'll hold your sketch pad," Brock offered, giving his brother an encouraging smile. The roller coaster wasn't very tall or fast, but James still gripped the safety bar tightly as they climbed the first hill. As they descended, his nervous expression transformed into pure delight. By the end of the ride, he was beaming. They spent the afternoon playing carnival games. At the ring toss, Brock's determination paid off when he finally landed a ring around a bottleneck. He immediately chose a soft blue elephant plush as his prize. "Here," he said, holding it out to James, "for being brave today." James hugged the elephant close, his eyes shining with gratitude. As evening approached, they settled on a bench near the Ferris wheel, sharing a massive cloud of pink cotton candy that stuck to their fingers and melted on their tongues. The setting sun cast long shadows across the park, and the first twinkling lights began to illuminate the rides. James looked up at Whitaker, his face sticky with sugar but radiating happiness. "This was the best day ever," he said softly. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle hum of the dishwasher when Brock looked up from his homework, his expression troubled. Whitaker noticed the change immediately, the way his shoulders tensed and his fingers fidgeted with his pencil. "Dad?" Brock's voice wavered slightly. "Why did the Smiths want us if they didn't care about us?" Whitaker set down his coffee mug, his heart heavy at the question. He knew this conversation would come eventually, but it still caught him off guard. Taking a deep breath, he chose his words carefully. "Sometimes people foster children for the wrong reasons," he explained gently. "The system is meant to help children find loving homes, but some people see it as a way to benefit themselves instead." Brock's brow furrowed. But how did they get away with it for so long? There were so many kids. From his spot at the corner of the table, James looked up from his drawing, his pencil stilling. Though quiet, Whitaker could see he was listening intently. "The system isn't perfect," Whitaker acknowledged. "There are gaps and problems that need fixing, but your case helped bring attention to these issues. Because of you both, other children will be better protected." James set his pencil down completely. "Do you think they'll try to take us back?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Whitaker reached across the table, placing his hands over each of theirs. "No one will ever take you away from me," he said firmly. "You're safe now. I promise." The tension in the room felt heavy until Brock's face brightened slightly. "Can we plant more flowers in the garden? Maybe some purple ones this time?" Whitaker smiled, grateful for the shift in mood. "Of course we can. We'll go to the nursery this weekend." That evening, as Whitaker tucked them into their beds, Brock wrapped his arms around him in a tight hug. "You're the dad we always needed," he whispered. From his bed, James nodded in agreement, his eyes full of trust. Whitaker felt his heart swell with love and gratitude, amazed at how far they'd come together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the backyard as Brock and James tended to their garden. James crouched beside the small sapling he'd chosen weeks ago, his fingers gently touching the tender new leaves sprouting from its branches. His eyes sparkled with quiet joy. "It's getting stronger," he observed softly, a hint of pride in his voice. Brock stood nearby, admiring his flourishing daisies. Their white petals seemed to glow in the morning light. "Just like us," he added with a warm smile. The screen door creaked open as Whitaker stepped out carrying a wooden tray with 3 tall glasses of fresh lemonade. Ice cubes clinked against the glass as he made his way over to the garden bench. "Look how much everything's grown," he said, setting down the tray. "The garden's really coming along beautifully." They settled onto the bench together, sipping their drinks and admiring their handiwork. Whitaker couldn't help but notice how different the twins seemed from those first uncertain days. More relaxed, more confident. "I was thinking," Brock said excitedly, "maybe we could add some purple flowers over there." He pointed to an empty patch near the fence. "And maybe some yellow ones too." James, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "Could we build a birdhouse?" His voice was soft but eager. "To hang from the tree?" Whitaker and Brock both turned to him, pleasantly surprised by the suggestion. Within an hour, they had gathered supplies from the garage and spread newspapers across the picnic table. Working together, they assembled the small wooden structure, with Whitaker guiding their hands as they hammered nails and joined the pieces. When it came time to paint, Brock chose vibrant blues and yellows, while James worked meticulously with a smaller brush, adding delicate details to the roof and entrance. His artistic talent showed in every careful stroke. As the paint dried in the afternoon sun, they selected the perfect branch, low enough to watch, but high enough to keep future bird families safe. Once secured, they stepped back to admire their work. James looked up at Whitaker, his eyes full of meaning. "This tree is our family tree now," he said simply. Whitaker felt his heart swell with emotion as he wrapped an arm around each boy's shoulders. "We'll take a picture every year," he promised, to see how it grows with us. The afternoon light streamed through the dining room windows as Whitaker spread the nonprofit paperwork across the table. Brock and James sat nearby, occasionally glancing up from their math homework with curious expressions. "What's the foundation for?" Brock finally asked, setting down his pencil. Whitaker looked up from the documents, smiling warmly. "It's called the Forever Families Foundation," he explained. "We're going to help foster children find permanent homes just like you two did, and we'll help families with resources they need to succeed." Brock's eyes lit up with interest. "Could we have events where kids meet families? Like fun ones with games and stuff? Not scary meetings in offices?" "That's actually a brilliant idea," Whitaker replied, making a note on his legal pad. Over the next few days, support poured in from unexpected places. Local businesses offered donations, and community members volunteered their time. Rachel arrived one afternoon with a stack of case files and a determined look in her eye. "We should hold a launch event," she suggested. "Get the word out, show people what we're trying to accomplish." Later that afternoon, Whitaker found himself in the backyard with the twins, painting the foundation's sign. Brock insisted on adding cheerful flowers around the border, while James meticulously detailed the lettering. When they thought Whitaker wasn't looking, they carefully wrote their names on the back of the sign. That evening, they gathered around the kitchen table, brainstorming ideas for the foundation's first project. James, usually quiet, spoke up hesitantly. "Maybe we could do art workshops," he suggested, fidgeting with his sleeve. "For kids like us." "And a gardening program," Brock chimed in excitedly. "Everyone should get to grow something of their own." Whitaker nodded, touched by their enthusiasm. "Both of those ideas will definitely be part of our mission," he promised. As the sun began to set, they stood together in the backyard, admiring their handiwork. The sign's fresh paint gleamed in the golden light. Brock reached out and placed his hand on Whitaker's arm. "You're helping more kids like us," he said softly. Whitaker smiled, feeling the weight of purpose settle comfortably on his shoulders. The spring breeze carried the scent of grilling hot dogs across the backyard, as children's laughter filled the air. Whitaker stood at the grill, spatula in hand, watching the scene before him with quiet joy. Brock darted through the garden with his school friends, their voices rising in excitement as they played an energetic game of tag. James sat cross-legged under the family tree with his classmate Tommy, showing him his latest sketches. Though still reserved, James had begun to open up more, especially when sharing his art. He pointed upward to the birdhouse they'd built together, a proud smile crossing his face as he explained how they'd painted it. "And look at our daisies," Brock called out, leading his friends to the flower bed. "We planted them ourselves. They're my mom's favorite flower." His voice carried a mix of happiness and gentle remembrance as he showed off the blooming garden. Rachel Green arrived carrying a homemade potato salad. She paused at the gate, taking in the scene before her. Children playing, food cooking, and, most importantly, Brock and James radiating happiness in their new home. She made her way to the grill where Whitaker stood. "You've done an incredible job," she said quietly, watching the twins interact with their friends. "They're thriving." Throughout the afternoon, the yard buzzed with activity. Brock enlisted his friends to help plant a new row of flowers, carefully explaining how to pat down the soil just as Whitaker had taught him. Meanwhile, James sat in a quiet corner, his pencil moving swiftly across paper as he captured the scene before him. As the day began to wind down, the children gathered in a circle on the lawn, ice cream cones in hand. Stories and giggles flowed freely as they shared tales from school and home. Brock and James exchanged proud glances as they talked about their new life with Whitaker, their faces glowing with contentment. When the last guest had left and quiet settled over the yard, the three of them sat together beneath their growing tree. The setting sun painted everything in warm, golden light, making the garden glow. Brock leaned against Whitaker's shoulder, a peaceful smile on his face. "This is the happiest I've ever been," he said softly. Whitaker wrapped an arm around him, his heart full. "Me too." James, sitting quietly beside them, nodded and added in his gentle voice, "It's perfect." Their soft laughter mingled with the evening breeze, a family that had fought so hard to find each other finally at peace. If you enjoyed the story of Brock and James, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.